For a moment, while he stood there like that, crying in dead silence, crying as if his round boy's head were made of marble and were a figure in a fountain, Mr. Evans slowly lifted up his bowed forehead with its great hook nose and stared at Dave's muddy trouser bottoms. What Mr. Evans felt now was, I must go through with this, though I get no pleasure from it. The curious thing, in the mind of this slave of the iron bar, was that it was the iron bar itself that now excited in him this relentless, pleasureless necessity to go on. What it was that sank down under the iron bar, a man, an ox, a sheep, a pig, mattered little to Mr. Evans. That it was his old acquaintance John, picked up at Stonehenge, who was the destined victim, hardly reached his intelligence. Nor did he think of the victim as even destined to be killed. It was not that at all. Oh, it was something very different from that. It was an anonymous action, too. That was the whole point. The unpardonable sin, like all other extreme forms of vice, was totally impersonal. It was motiveless except for its own single urge, and it was surrounded by a vacuum of anonymity. If there were Mr. Evans's thoughts that the great young communist closed his appeal by this fit of passionate tears, the thoughts of the crowd who had listened to him were totally submerged in a spellbound fit of stupefied bewilderment. The room remained absolutely hushed. No one lifted a finger to meddle with what he chose to do now. He stepped down slowly from the chair to the floor. He was in a trance. That is how it felt to himself, and that is how it looked to the crowd in the room. A trance and a complete forgetfulness of where he was. Vaguely, with short shuffling steps, more like those of a convalescent than a somnambulist, he went to the street door, opened it, and just as he was, with an overcoat on, but without hat or stick, walked off towards Street Road. He felt at that moment a strong desire to look into the sympathetic and yet non-human eyes of the head of the Glastonbury commune. He felt purged, relaxed, reduced to an almost feminine softness, and he longed for the sympathy of Mr. Geard, as a strong girl might have done. When Mr. Evans awoke from the drowsiness caused by our special, he no longer perceived in front of him, mounted upon a chair, a pair of gray, ready-made trousers, and in the sudden awakening he leaned towards his nodding companion. When had I better meet you up there? He said. Fintaler only let his straggling beard sink still lower over the table. Mr. Evans grew irritable and shook him violently, gripping the lean man's shambly shoulder unnecessarily hard with his bony fingers. Not so very many people in Glastonbury had fallen gently upon sleep that forenoon, upon sleep softer than the mosses of Medcroft Lane, tenderer than the blue vapors of Wick Wood. But among these fortunate ones there was certainly only two, Mr. Toller and Owen Evans, whose thoughts, as they gave way to slumber, had run upon murder. When had I better meet you up there? It was not Mr. Evans who spoke these words. It was a little fork-tongued worm snake. This worm snake was jerking and curving and cresting and lifting a head that kept changing color like a salamander. And it was doing all this inside a human automaton, dead as a corpse. Oops, I lost my spots. Dead as a corpse. The carcass of what used to be Mr. Evans. Whatever this worm snake, which kept emitting a poisonous froth like a snail that had been wounded, ordered this corpse man, this homo mortis, to do, the corpse man obeyed. To the excited worm snake it was a swooning, gasping, fainting ecstasy to think of that iron bar. There was a quivering, dissolving, melting sweetness connected with it. The iron bar and the life it was going to blot out were altogether detached from ordinary experience. It was not John Crow who was going to be perished. It was simply the man under the bar. The corpse-like executioner who obeyed this worm was the galvanized body of the pedantic and highly strung Mr. Evans, who, under normal conditions, could not hurt a daddy longlegs. Once, when he was very young and seized by a sadistic frenzy, and it is quite possible that the whole thing started from his father's forcing his mother to let him enjoy her long after the child's conception had begun, he had killed something with a piece of iron. After that, the little Owen would frantically turn over the pages of all the children's books to find pictures of creatures being killed, especially killed by heavily crushing instruments. It had to be a thing of iron, and it had to come crashing down, smashing everything, smashing skull and vertebrae altogether, or the performance demanded with such a swooning, trembling, fainting orgasm by the worm snake not be a master one. Mr. Evans' tone as he said, "Meet you up there," was like the tone of some Asmodeus whispering to some Baphomet. "Meet you up there," echoed the sticky surface of their table. "Meet you up there," echoed the dregs of our special. "Meet you up there," echoed a little bit of dried-up dog's dung, which had been detached from one of the thick-soled boots of Dave Spear and left behind on the chair. To the worm snake inside, which was once Mr. Evans, this harmless sentence, "meet you up there," partook of the nature of an overpowering sexual temptation. The actual sound of the brief syllable, "meet up there," was like an erotic provocation of a kind that none would bear and not yield. The fangs of the worm snake dripped from the frothy milk, and mounted in erected expectancy, in blunt-nosed expectancy, in forked-tongued expectancy, and danced a lust dance of delirious joy when it found that it could make this slave corpse, this dread soul, this rex mortis, that had been a human being, utter these simple words. And to what end? To the end of observing how an iron bar, if given a modicum of propulsion from the thin arm of Codfin, would obey the law of gravitation. The pale blue eyes of Codfin opened now just a little. They were blinking and confused, and moisture trickled from their lids. "Eh, what's that, pard? Meet you, did I say?" "Yes, yes, yes!" cried the cresting worm through the lips of Mr. Evans. "When shall I meet you up there?" About 5 hours later, Mr. Evans was seated on one of the iron seats of the slope of Whirl Hill, watching little boys play rounders. Now, rounders might be defined as the innocent childhood of baseball, of which it is obviously the original source, and it is a game of the simplest and most primitive hit-and-run nature. And Mr. Evans became extremely interested in rounders that afternoon. Every time one of the boys hit the ball, Mr. Evans could see the lean, swooping figure, not of the John he knew, but of an abstract victim whose name he called John, and of a victim so completely dehumanized and depersonalized that all question of saving him disappeared. The only thing to do was to stop the horror. As Mad Bet had screamed to Mr. Evans and Mother Leg's party on Easter Monday, the only thing to do was to stop, and then to wash the sand clean in the mind's fatal Colosseum. But Mr. Evans could not stop. He watched this hit-and-run game with peculiar and special interest because it was exactly what he was going to do himself. He was going to hit and run, or rather to watch. But Christ would say it was the same thing. Someone else hit and run. Was not Mr. Evans mad? Not unless all sexual desire, from the satisfaction of which other sentiences suffer unnecessary suffering, is mad. If any stranger had approached Mr. Evans on that afternoon, as he sat watching this game of rounders on Whirl Hill, and induced him to enter into conversation, it is extremely unlikely that the faintest notion of the man's being mad would have crossed such a stranger's intelligence. He had, it is true, been totally unable to eat a morsel of anything since breakfast, but he had been drinking again, He had gone into a little nameless beer house on the way to Whirl Hill and had drunk glass after glass of beer. I must drink, he had thought grimly to himself as he tossed up the heel taps of each separate glass. I must drink to render myself stupid, as Pascal said about believing the Christian faith. But he had not rendered himself stupid. He had, on the contrary, given himself a raking headache. But otherwise, nothing could be clearer from Mr. Evans's mind. He was to go up there at sunset and wait inside the tower to see, actually in his flesh to see, what he had been telling himself stories about all his life long. Let no one think that the obedient Rex Mortis, or Deus Mortis, that was Mr. Evans's soul, did not weigh the possible consequences, down to every smallest detail of what he was going to do, making himself, by thus knowing about it beforehand and doing nothing to stop it, an accomplice in a murder. Undoubtedly I shall land in jail, he thought. It's possible enough that it will be worse than that. Why, in God's name, then, don't I walk straight back to the shop, or home to Cordy, and shake off this monstrous weight? The police? To go to the police? No. The thing to do is... At this point, the invisible worm itself began whispering a subtle self-deception, a cunning compromise. Go up there and get hold of the iron bar myself. Yes, that's the thing to do. From every point of view. To go up there presently, it's too early yet. And as soon as Toller appears, just take the thing from him and pack him off. And then tell Crow, or not tell Crow, as I consider best at the time, get hold of that thing from Toller first anyway, and pack him off, and perhaps it would be better never to tell Crow, or any other living soul about it. Yes, never tell anyone about it. But would Toller try it again? It's some madness of that bald-headed woman, the Grail messenger. I couldn't follow it when he was telling me. Madness of some kind. Damn! His mind called up the image of Mad Bet as she had seemed to him that night when she had made him kiss her naked skull. A wry smile twisted his lips as he thought of that night, and he clutched the iron bar, another and a different one, that made the elbow of his present resting place. A sardonic and tormented chuckle, a veritable damned soul chuckle, broke from his twisted mouth. Hee! My Grail messenger. It's all mixed up with Crow. It was Crow who asked me that night if I can embrace a woman who was perfectly hideous, and I told him then about the Grail messenger. Hee! Mallory, you old devil, that's life still in your Norman book. Yes. You understand these little things. Life's not changed. It's all come round and back again. What happened now, as the man sat there clutching the iron elbow of the cold seat, while the little boys kept hitting and running in front of him, was that his first nature, the antiquarian one, was all stirred up into a writhing weft of self-protective fantasy. And this had come about in a very subtle manner, for by saying to himself that what he must do anyway was to go up there, even if he snatched the iron bar from the bewitched assassin and confessed everything to John Crow, he had covered with a sort of adhesive plaster and gaping hole of his tormented consciousness. And this covered up the dark, sweet, irresistible twitching of the snake worm, left his normal upper consciousness free to deceive him to the limit with accumulated plausibilities, while all the time the worm licked its devouring fangs in the darkness below. What the worm said to himself was, "Let us all only once go up there, in the swooning, drowning, the solving ecstasy of the dolorous blow will soon sweep away all these conscientious hesitations." Conned eased a great deal by this crafty compromise with his conscience, which rendered his rendezvous with the iron bar a necessity if he were to save John Crow, as well as the possibility of playing the ecstatic voyeur at a murder orgy if he decided against saving John Crow. His eyes now fell upon the figure of an elderly woman walking heavily and stumblingly up the slope of the hill below the level where he was sitting and the boys were playing.